The long-haul trucker had seen trouble before, but nothing like this. As the sun dipped behind the desert horizon, a biker gang blocked the road, their masked faces full of menace. 5 against 1. The leader grinned, tapping his knife against his boot. "Out of the truck, old man!" But they had no idea this wasn't just any trucker, and tonight they had picked the wrong fight. They thought he was just another trucker until he showed them who they were really messing with. What would you have done in his place? Let us know in the comments. Like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more thrilling stories. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the endless stretch of desert highway. The heat shimmered off the asphalt, making the road ahead look like a mirage. It was the kind of place where you could disappear, where no one would hear you scream. Jake had been driving for hours, his rig humming steadily beneath him. He wasn't the kind of man who looked for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. As he approached a narrow pass between 2 rocky outcrops, he saw them half a dozen motorcycles parked haphazardly across the road, their riders standing beside them, waiting. An outlaw biker gang. Jake's grip tightened on the wheel. He'd been on the road long enough to know the type. Guys like this weren't just looking for a friendly chat, they were looking for an easy target. But they had picked the wrong man. Slowing the truck to a stop, Jake exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the gang. Leather jackets, chains, boots covered in dust. Their leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward, his gloved hands resting on his belt. Jake stayed in his truck for a moment, letting the silence stretch. The gang expected him to be nervous, expected him to hesitate. Instead, he killed the engine and climbed down, his boots crunching against the dirt. The leader smirked. "Evening, driver," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "Nice rig you got there." Jake crossed his arms. "Something I can help you boys with?" The gang chuckled. One of them, a wiry man with a knife hanging from his belt, spat into the dust. "Yeah, actually, you're on our road. That means you pay a toll." Jake tilted his head slightly. "I must have missed the sign." The leader chuckled. "That's the thing about our tolls, they ain't exactly written down." Jake sighed, glancing at the horizon. No cars, no witnesses, just him and them. The leader took a step closer. "Let's make this easy, old man. You hand over your wallet, maybe throw in a few valuables from your cab, and we let you roll on out of here." The gang murmured in agreement, a few nodding, others adjusting their weapons, knives, chains, a few carrying pistols they weren't bothering to hide. Jake exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. "That's a hell of an offer." The leader's grin widened. "Ain't it?" Jake stared at him for a moment, then shook his head. "Nah." The gang fell silent. The leader's smile twitched. "Nah?" he repeated. Jake turned slightly, as if considering getting back in his truck. "I don't pay tolls to amateurs." A murmur ran through the gang, a few shifting on their feet. The leader's smirk disappeared. "I think you misunderstand." "No," Jake interrupted, locking eyes with him. "I don't." The gang bristled, their casual amusement fading. The leader's hand twitched toward his belt. Jake didn't move. The air grew heavier. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The sun dipped lower, and the real trouble was about to begin. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, like the air before a storm. The gang no longer looked amused. The leader's smirk had disappeared, replaced with something colder, meaner. "You got a mouth on you, old man," he said, rolling his shoulders. "That's not a good thing." Jake didn't blink. He had seen men like this before, bullies who thought they could take what they wanted because they traveled in packs. The leader gestured to one of his men. A tall, wiry guy with a jagged scar across his throat stepped forward, pulling a knife from his belt. He turned it over in his hand, letting the sunlight glint off the blade. "How about this?" the leader continued. "You give us your keys, we take a little ride in your truck, and if we're feeling generous, we leave you breathing." Jake exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. He could see it now. They weren't just after cash. They wanted the whole damn rig. The scarred man took another step closer, flipping the knife between his fingers. "What's it gonna be, Grandpa?" he sneered. Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. The leader scoffed. "You ain't the smartest trucker, are you? Look around." He gestured toward his men, who were now spreading out, half-circling Jake, cutting off any escape. One of them pulled a chain from his belt, letting it rattle menacingly. Another cracked his knuckles, grinning. The leader stepped forward until he was nearly nose to nose with Jake. "This is the part where you make the right decision." Jake finally looked at him, his gaze steady. "You boys sure you want to do this?" The leader's eye twitched. He wasn't used to hesitation, wasn't used to someone looking him in the eye without fear. Scarneck lost patience. With a snarl, he lunged forward, shoving Jake hard in the chest. Jake barely moved. The gang laughed, but it was forced now, uncertain. Something about the way Jake just stood there, unflinching, made them uneasy. The leader, masking his irritation, nodded to Scarneck. "Teach him some manners." Scarneck grinned, flipping the knife in his grip, and stepped in close. The moment he did, Jake's eyes flickered with something dangerous. He had given them their chance. They hadn't taken it, and now they were about to regret it. Scarneck barely had time to react before Jake moved. Like a coiled spring, Jake's hand shot forward, seizing Scarneck's wrist in an iron grip. The knife never reached its mark. With a sharp twist, Jake wrenched the thug's arm back, forcing a pained yelp from his throat. The blade clattered to the ground. The gang stopped laughing. Jake shoved Scarneck backward, sending him stumbling into the dirt. The others instinctively reached for their weapons, but Jake was already moving. With a quick step, he scooped up the dropped knife and held it up, his grip firm, his stance steady. "You punks think you're tough?" Jake's voice was low, steady, but there was an unmistakable edge now, one that made men hesitate. "You've been running wild, thinking no one could stand up to you." He pointed the knife at the leader. "But today you ran into the wrong man." The leader clenched his jaw. He wasn't about to back down in front of his crew. "You think one lucky move changes anything?" He pulled out a switchblade of his own, flicking it open. "You're outnumbered, old man." Jake let out a slow breath. "That's where you boys really screwed up." He dropped the knife and raised his fists. "See, I don't need a blade to deal with amateurs like you." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The trucker was supposed to be weak, helpless. But now, standing there, unshaken, unafraid, they were starting to realize they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The silence in the desert stretched long and thin, the air thick with dust and tension. The gang stood frozen, their cocky sneers now replaced by something else: hesitation. Fear. Jake rolled his shoulders, cracking his knuckles as he took a step forward, his eyes locked onto the leader, the one who had been barking orders like he was invincible. "You still think you're in control here?" The leader, brute named Colt, tried to mask his nerves, gripping his knife tighter. "You're one man. We're five." His voice wavered slightly, but he forced a smirk. "You really think you can take us all?" Jake exhaled, shaking his head. "You punks don't get it." Then he moved. Fast. Before anyone could react, Jake swung his fist like a sledgehammer, cracking into the jaw of the nearest biker. The man crumpled instantly, hitting the dirt like a sack of bricks. The second man lunged, but Jake sidestepped, driving his elbow into the guy's ribs. A pained grunt escaped his lips before he too collapsed to his knees. Colt's confidence shattered in real time. The leader of the gang, so used to being feared, watched as his men dropped like flies. One of them, panicked, reached for a pistol. Jake's boot connected with his wrist before he could even pull it from his vest. The gun spun into the sand, and the biker howled in pain, clutching his arm. Now it was just Colt. He backed away, knife still in hand, but the bravado had bled from his face. This ain't over," he stammered. Jake smirked. "Oh, it is." With deliberate slowness, he stepped toward Colt, who flinched. The gang leader had probably never backed down from a fight in his life. But now, he was looking for a way out. "Go ahead," Jake taunted. "Make a move." Colt clenched his teeth, his grip tightening on the knife. But deep down, he already knew he'd lost. Jake stepped even closer, close enough that Colt could see the steel in his eyes. "If you run now, maybe your crew will still respect you." Jake's voice dropped lower. "But if you stand here any longer, I'm going to make sure you never lead another gang again." Colt hesitated. Then, in a final act of cowardice, he turned sprinting toward his bike. His men, groaning in the dust, watched as their leader fled. Jake stood tall, watching him go. "That's what I thought." The remaining gang members, now leaderless, scrambled to their feet, avoiding Jake's gaze as they limped after Colt. As their engines roared to life and they sped off into the desert, one truth settled over them. They weren't the feared outlaws they thought they were. And the trucker they had tried to intimidate? He had just ripped their reputation apart, piece by piece. The roar of motorcycle engines faded into the desert, leaving behind a stillness that stretched across the open road. Jake stood there, watching the dust settle, his hands relaxed but his mind sharp. The fight was over, but the lesson had only just begun. He turned back toward his truck, feeling the weight of the moment settle deep in his bones. He had been through wars, real ones fought on foreign soil with higher stakes than this. But somehow the principle was always the same. Men who thought they were untouchable often learned the hard way that there was always someone stronger, someone smarter, someone who had seen far worse than they could ever imagine. Jake climbed into his rig, gripping the worn leather of the steering wheel. His heart rate had slowed, the adrenaline fading, but the memories of the past few minutes were burned into him. He had been tested, and like always, he had stood his ground. The truck rumbled to life beneath him, a familiar sound, a comfort. He adjusted the rear-view mirror, catching one last glimpse of the empty road behind him. The bikers had learned their lesson. Whether they'd remember it was another story. Jake had seen plenty of men like them, too arrogant to listen, too reckless to learn. He wasn't one to teach people the hard way unless they forced his hand, and tonight they had. As he pulled back onto the highway, the sun dipping below the horizon, a question nagged at him. How many times had he been underestimated? How many times had people seen just a trucker and assumed he was nothing more? But that's the thing about the road. It doesn't care who you are or where you come from. It tests you, forces you to prove yourself, and if you're not ready, it will break you. Jake had been tested long before this night, and that's why he was still here. He reached over to the passenger seat, grabbing a bottle of water and taking a long sip. His knuckles were sore, but it was a dull pain, the kind he could ignore, the kind that reminded him he was still standing. The road stretched ahead, endless and open, just the way he liked it. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't looking for fights. But when trouble found him, he made damn sure it regretted showing up. Maybe that's the lesson. Respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn. And tonight, those bikers had lost theirs. Jake exhaled, shaking his head as he pushed the truck into higher gear. Another town, another stop, another mile down the road. And maybe, just maybe, the next time some cocky gang thought about pushing around the wrong guy, they'd think twice. But what about you? Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever had to remind someone exactly who they were dealing with? Tell your story in the comments. And if you like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned, because out here on the road, there's always another story waiting to be told.